Good evening, everybody. Welcome on behalf of Mass Peace Action and our co-sponsor, Jewish Voice for Peace. We're expecting an interesting evening, informative, and more importantly, the beginning of the kind of discussion we need to have to actually make some changes in the status quo and U.S. policies, especially a way to begin the process of confronting the kind of one-sided conversation about the issue of Palestine and Israel and the Middle East in general that's taking place in D.C. by our representatives, theoretically on our behalf. We're very fortunate tonight to have with us to stimulate this discussion Professor Stephen Walt. Most of you know of him. His book with his co-author John Mearsheimer on the Israel lobby and U.S. foreign policy is well known. We're grateful to him and his co-author for beginning to talk about a reality that everybody understands, especially in Washington, but nobody was allowed to talk about until quite recently. And it's symptomatic of that quieting of discussion about this issue that the two co-authors, before their book came out, announced the beginning of their findings, a summary of their findings, in the London Review of Books, and not in a publication in the United States. So we're going to learn about the workings of the Israel lobby and how it affects U.S. policy, both with respect to Israel-Palestine and the wider Middle East. We're going to hear begin to talk about ways we can change that. Professor Walt is not only a professor at the Kennedy School of Government in Foreign Affairs and not only an expert on the Israel lobby, but has written very widely on foreign affairs in general and has consistently urged political and military policy of restraint with respect to potential wars, past and future. So without any more, could you please welcome Professor Walt.
Okay, so I need to use the microphone here so this gets picked up on the recording that they're making. So I'll be standing here a little bit like a Vegas nightclub person. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight, and I want to start by thanking Jeff Klein for the invitation to come talk about how we might encourage the United States to have a more sensible policy in the Middle East, a Middle East policy that is less beholden to the Israel lobby, more consistent with American interests and with basic principles of peace and justice. I want to emphasize at the outset that the goal, at least as I see it, is not to single out any particular organizations or particular groups for censure or to push the United States to adopt an anti-Israel position. On the contrary, the goal should be a policy that would be better for the United States, better for Israel, and of course better for the other peoples in the region. So what I'm going to do is start by summarizing my own work with John Mearsheimer on the subject very briefly, and then talk about how I think circumstances have changed since we published our article and our book back in 2006, 2007. And then I want to spend some time laying out some lessons or maybe an action program that I derive partly from what we learned by writing the book, but also by what we've seen happen since then, some lessons learned and maybe advice for going forward. So let me say a few words about what we wrote in the book and also what we didn't write in the book. The core argument was straightforward and in some ways not particularly surprising. We weren't saying anything that people in Washington in particular didn't already know. First, we argued there was a special relationship between the United States and Israel, which was unlike any other bilateral relationship in American foreign policy. The United States giving Israel enormous amounts of economic, military aid, consistent diplomatic support and protection, and doing this almost unconditionally. It didn't matter what Israel did, it would still get the same amount of support from the United States. It was also unusual, of the 190 plus countries in the world, it was the only one that was largely immune from any form of serious criticism by American politicians. Indeed, if you look carefully, politicians routinely expressed feelings of commitment and devotion that they would never utter toward France or Germany or Japan or any other close American ally. That was first point. Second point is we argued that you couldn't explain this on strategic or moral grounds. It wasn't because Israel was such a valuable strategic partner or because it was morally better than other countries. You could argue that maybe Israel was a strategic asset during the Cold War, but the Cold War was now over, and it was increasingly, in fact, a liability. The moral case was undermined by Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, and especially by the prolonged occupation. Yet if you looked over time, that special relationship was actually getting deeper, even though those explanations were getting weaker. The question was why, and of course the real explanation was the political influence of the so-called Israel lobby. We defined the lobby as a loose coalition of individuals and organizations that actively worked to promote a special relationship, that special relationship of nearly unconditional U.S. support. And we emphasized that the activities of these groups and organizations were in most respects no different than other interest groups, like the financial industry, the National Rifle Association, the farm lobby, or any number of other ethnic lobbies that are part and parcel of American politics. It's the way the American political systems work. The Israel lobby happened to be particularly influential, but what it was doing was not really any different than other powerful interest groups. We also documented how these same individuals and organizations tried to shape or control discourse on this subject by writing their own books and articles, by funding think tanks like the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, by putting pressure on media organizations and even on universities whenever they published or broadcast anything that was critical of the special relationship, critical of the lobby, or critical of Israel itself. And some members of the lobby also tried to smear opponents by accusing them of being anti-Semitic, even when this charge was baseless. Fifth, we argued that this special relationship and the various policies that were pushed by the major organizations in the lobby were not in the American national interest or in Israel's long-term interest either. For example, the lobby's influence made it impossible for the United States to be an honest broker in the Middle East, which is one of the reasons why repeated American efforts to promote a peace settlement between Israel and the Palestinians have all failed, and why the settlements had grown steadily over the past 40-plus years, even though it was the official policy of the U.S. government that this was a bad thing. The lobby, we argued, and especially its neoconservative wing, had played a key role in convincing the Bush administration to invade Iraq in 2003. And we argued that the lobby had also worked to thwart any possible détente with Iran, a policy that had failed to halt Iran's nuclear program and increase the risk of war. Again, these are all policies that really aren't good for anyone. So we argued that the United States should have a normal relationship with Israel, a relationship like it's our relations with other democracies in the world, not a special relationship, and in particular that Washington should use its considerable leverage to try and encourage a two-state solution. Now that's basically the argument of the book, which I think some of you have probably read. But just for the record, here's what we didn't say. We didn't question Israel's legitimacy or right to exist. On the contrary, we said repeatedly in the book that the United States should come to Israel's aid if its survival were ever at risk. We did not describe the lobby as a cabal or some kind of secret conspiracy. In fact, we repeatedly said that it was, again, an interest group like lots of other interest groups here in America. We did not blame Israel for all the problems in the Middle East or say that a different relationship with Israel would immediately solve all of those problems. We said it would help, but it wasn't a magic bullet or anything like that. We did not say that the lobby controlled every aspect of American Middle East policy or American foreign policy, or argue that it was the only reason why the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, or the only reason why we have a difficult relationship with Iran. We didn't accuse members of the lobby or people who work for AIPAC of being disloyal, or say that something should be done to limit their power or marginalize them in American politics. In fact, in the conclusion of the book, we even argued that a powerful pro-Israel lobby would be a good thing to have if only it were advocating smarter and more humane policies. So the question is, what's changed since we wrote this book and spent some time holding on to the third rail? The most obvious and dramatic change since 2006 has been, I think, a dramatic opening up of the conversation, opening up of public discourse on this general topic. Discussions of U.S. Middle East policy and U.S.-Israeli relations are more open now, and a much wider range of views are now being expressed in public and occasionally even in mainstream circles. Media figures including Tom Friedman, Nicholas Kristof, Roger Cohen, all of the New York Times, Andrew Sullivan, a very prominent blogger, now write openly and critically about Israeli policy, about American one-sided support, and about the lobby's role in promoting that special relationship. Articles about American Middle East policy increasingly mention the lobby's influence. It's no longer a taboo or no longer confined to the last paragraph or two as kind of an afterthought. Books like Peter Beinart's Crisis of Zionism, Daniel Fleshler's Transforming America's Israel Lobby, John Judas's recent book Genesis have provided further evidence of the role the lobby plays in driving U.S. policy and the role it has played in the past. People like M.J. Rosenberg have emerged as articulate and knowledgeable critics. M.J. is a former AIPAC employee. Writers like Max Blumenthal have published critical accounts of Israel's drift to the right and some of its consequences. Just today I was reading a piece by Bernard Avishai in The New Yorker, documenting the same sorts of things as well. Websites like Mondoweiss, Muzzle Watch, Electronic Intifada, and others are providing alternative perspectives, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Groups like J Street, Jewish Voice for Peace, Code Pink, Americans for Peace Now, and many others have become more visible and more effective in presenting an alternative view to the one that Americans have gotten for many years. Now, I want to emphasize the groups, websites, and authors I've just mentioned do not agree on every single issue. There's some heterogeneity of opinion in there. My point is that there's a much wider range of views now available for people in the public domain. Now, there's another reason for that. This is not entirely our doing by any means. A number of events in recent years have made the lobby's power pretty hard to miss. Right? If there's an elephant in the room, the elephant is really quite visible, wearing tap shoes and dancing. First of all, the failure of Obama's effort to achieve a two-state solution, especially in his first term, the dramatic retreat of the Obama administration made that quite clear, and Peter Beinart documents it very well in his book, Crisis of Zionism. The craven American response to Operation Cast Lead, including our subsequent trashing of the Goldstone report. Netanyahu's repeated humiliations of Obama, and the spectacle of the 2012 election, where all of the Republican candidates basically looked like fools trying to out-pander each other in appealing to Israel's supporters, and where Sheldon Adelson spent some $100 million unsuccessfully trying to buy a successful candidate. Because the discourse is more open and because there are more sources of information available, people could see this happening, and they could put two and two together. So the real world, in some respects, has made this more obvious to us. There's another positive development. The accusation of anti-Semitism is losing its power to intimidate. And I want to be very clear about this. Like all forms of bigotry, anti-Semitism is an ignorant and despicable practice, and we should all condemn it when it appears. But at the same time, using the false charge of anti-Semitism to stifle debate, and in some cases to destroy people's reputations or even their careers, is an ugly tactic that has no place in a democracy, and the people who use it in this way should be called to account. Fortunately, this tactic has been so overused and used against so many people who are obviously not anti-Semites that it is no longer able to have the same chilling effect on conversation, which again makes it easier to have a candid and honest set of discussions about these issues, and it also makes it easier for us to condemn real bigotry when it appears if we haven't debased the charge by using it so frequently. A third change is that the policies the lobby has been promoting are increasingly hard to defend. Instead of a weak, beleaguered Israeli David surrounded by a hostile Arab Goliath, an image, by the way, that was never completely accurate, we have a powerful, nuclear-armed Israel maintaining a brutal occupation for more than 4 decades and using its military power to dominate a Palestinian population which is denied essentially all political rights, and doing all that with the firm support of the U.S. government. More and more people now recognize this situation is shameful and embarrassing. It makes no sense. Fourth, AIPAC and other hardline groups in the lobby have lost some important fights in recent years. Back in 2007, 2008, they could not convince the Bush administration to use military force against Iran or to support an Israeli use of force against Iran's nuclear program. They could not derail the nomination of Chuck Hagel to be Secretary of Defense, though some particularly hardline groups in the lobby tried in some particularly ugly ways. Last summer, AIPAC and other groups could not convince the Obama administration to use force in Syria